welcome you and thank you all so much for joining today's panel discussion on the next steps in the anti-trafficking movement. My name is Michelle Mason and I'm a Policy and Operations Associate at the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution. Today's panel is the final in a series of 4 virtual panels on human trafficking, intersectionality, and the criminal justice system. I'd like to thank John Jay Student Council for partnering with us on the series, and I'd like to thank the John Jay Pre-Law Institute, the Office of External Affairs, and the Psychology Department for co-sponsoring the series. I would also like to give a very special thank you to John Jay Psychology Professor Anila Duro and John Jay Student Council President Amber Rivero. They were the driving force behind this series, and I'm grateful for all the time and expertise that they shared in the development of the series. Unfortunately, Amber is unable to deliver the opening remarks this morning due to her student activism work, but her contributions to the series will not go unnoticed. I welcome you all to follow our socials at IIP_JJAY to register and stay up to date on all of our upcoming panel events. You can watch the previous panel series, previous panels in the series at the link that I had sent in the chat. Before I introduce our panelists, I'm going to take this time to read our land acknowledgement statement, which honors both the land and culture of Indigenous people. We want to acknowledge that the IIP and John Jay College are based in New York City, which is Lenapehoking, the Lenape homeland. We honor all of the Indigenous nations and their land with great gratitude and acknowledge the genocide and continuous displacement of Indigenous peoples. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built Manhattan during the colonial era and beyond. We acknowledge the harm inflicted upon Indigenous communities and people of color across the country, which inspires our ongoing work. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to read brief bios for each of our panelists. I dropped the link of their full bios in the chat, which I encourage you all to read. We're fortunate to have such accomplished and passionate people with us today. So without further ado, our first panelist is Anita Tika. Anita is a senior director of the Anti-Trafficking program at Safe Horizon. She oversees an interdisciplinary team of attorneys, social workers, trainers, and administrative staff that provide comprehensive services to all victims of human trafficking. Our second panelist is Lauren Hirsch. Lauren is an internationally recognized lawyer, activist, educator, and writer working to combat violence against women and girls in school, online, and in the legal arena. She is the founder and national director of World Without Exploitation, a national coalition to end human trafficking and sexual exploitation. She is also the former chief of the sex trafficking unit at the Kings County District Attorney's Office. Next is Chris Stark. Chris is a writer, organizer, and researcher with Ojibwe and Cherokee ancestry. Her first novel, Nichols, A Tale of Disassociation, was a Lambda Literary finalist. Her writing has been published in numerous books and journals. The research she conducts on sex trafficking of Native women is included in her academic article, Strategies to Restore Justice for Sex Trafficked Native Women. Next, we have Christian Eduardo. Christian is a survivor leader at Sanctuary for Families and a member of the ECPAT USA's Survival Council. Christian is an advocate, speaker, and educator for the anti-trafficking initiatives, including the Equity Model, as well as other anti-trafficking initiatives, such as immigration and LGBTQ+ rights. Christian is also a student who is science and engineering oriented. Last but not least is Selena Higgins. She is the inaugural executive director of the NYC Administration for Child Services Office of Child Trafficking Prevention and Policy. She is the lead of all aspects of trafficking related services within New York City child welfare systems, and has been integral to the development of policies, procedures, trainings, and groups that support staff and benefit youth. Thank you all for joining us. And before I ask my first question, I invite the audience to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send questions throughout today's panel. If time permits, we hope to respond to some of the audience questions. So my first question is to each and every one of our panelists. What is the work that you do around human trafficking? And what are some of the contemporary challenges involving your work in assisting survivors? Can we begin with Selena?
Thank you very much for having me here today. So my office is the primary resource for work with trafficked and at-risk youth in the New York City child welfare system, and that's a lot of youth. In 2019, we identified over 2,000 youth who were either trafficked or at risk for trafficking, and each one of them benefited from some aspect of our work. We administrate the New York City Safe Harbor program, and that means that we provide services for youth who are not in the child welfare system, and we also administrate the Safe Harbor grant and other funding to purchase services, anti-trafficking services for youth, whether within the system or not. We create policies and procedures, and we just launched our first internal agency-wide policy, and I'll talk a little more about that later. And we also produce conferences and training events, and we have one upcoming in January called the 2021 New York City Child Sex Trafficking Conference, a 14-day virtual event to which all of you can attend, and it's completely free. We also provide therapeutic group work at the residentials. We have a tattoo removal program, which is also free, and a wealth and a variety of different training aspects, including a 40-page spiral-bound book called Understanding Child Trafficking and What You Can Do for It, a toolkit for child welfare professionals. And we also have shared mailboxes, which are operational 24/7, 365, because communication is key. And we are within multidisciplinary and child safety conferences. So the three challenges that I think really are the most important concern the intricacies of working with trafficked youth who've experienced multiple traumas, which resulted in their involvement in the child welfare system. The public perception, the lack of recognition that trafficked youth under age 18 are not prostitutes or sex workers. They are survivors of abuse. And the services deficit, because we have an insufficient number of New York City-based programs, both external and residential, with the expertise to work with juvenile trafficking survivors. Especially, we lack services for boys and men and LGBTQ youth and adults.
Thank you. Anita, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you for having me. So at the Anti-Trafficking program at Safe Horizon, we cover a number of different focus areas. We have a team of lawyers who only do immigration work, and they represent all of our undocumented foreign national human trafficking victims. All of our labor traffic victims at the moment are foreign nationals, and you can imagine what immigration relief under this current administration has looked like. We also have a team of social workers, and they provide comprehensive case management, trauma-focused therapy, and a plethora of other types of supportive counseling and access to different referrals and public benefits to all of our clients across the board, whether they're foreign nationals or US citizens. We have a pretty robust training and outreach program, and we provide internal trainings to fellow Safe Horizon colleagues. We're a 1,000+ position organization, and we operate the child advocacy centers and the family justice centers and a number of other different institutions within New York City. And so we know that trafficked individuals are coming in through these different points of entry at Safe Horizon. And we feel it's very important to train our fellow colleagues so they can cross-identify individuals who have been trafficked and can refer them to our program or to other anti-trafficking service providers if they need additional support. We also train law enforcement entities, government agencies, and other service providers. Lastly, we have a very strong policy and advocacy component to the program. So I represent the anti-trafficking program in 8 or 9 different coalitions at the local, state, federal, and global levels. And we engage in legislative policy reform. We help with bill drafting. We're working on the Trafficking Victims Protection Act reauthorization, for example, and we also co-chair the Brooklyn Human Trafficking Task Force, which is one of the federally funded task forces in New York State, and it's the only federally funded task force in New York City. We've been partnering with the Kings County DA's office on that for about the last 8 or 9 years, and I think Selena's part of the task force, and Sanctuary for Families is part of the task force, and so we have a lot of interrelated relationships with a number of stakeholders in the movement in the city. In terms of contemporary challenges, the first one that comes to mind, of course, is COVID. I think as a direct service provider, we have seen such an influx of not only continuing clients to come in, our referral numbers have actually increased during the last few months during this coronavirus pandemic. But we've also seen a boomerang effect of older, more traditionally stable clients. And how can we tell if a client is stable? It's really up to each client to define that for themselves and what that means. But we've seen a number of clients who've been out of the program for a sustained period of time, who have become sick or lost their jobs or become food or housing insecure. And so they've needed to return to the program for additional financial support and services. And some have returned for trauma-focused therapy because these are very difficult times. And a lot of your past trauma can resurface when you're dealing with all of these other external factors that affect your day-to-day survival. We also, and this is not so contemporary as in current day, but last 4 years, a lot of the anti-immigrant challenges. So a lot of the anti-immigrant policies have deeply affected our clients. Most of our clients are labor trafficked, and across the board, whether we're talking about our sex and labor trafficked clients, the majority of our clients are foreign national immigrants. And so under this administration, with these particular policies that have been put into place, our clients have been treated as immigrants first and human trafficking survivors second. And that's had a pretty detrimental effect on how these policies impact them. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. And Christian, would you like to go next and tell us a little bit more about your work and some challenges that you're seeing?
Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and spending some time with these amazing people. So as Michelle mentioned, I'm a survivor of international domestic sex and labor trafficking. I have become a speaker and do I really work creating awareness about what is human trafficking, how it's impacting our communities, and what we can do better. Because I think so that we have failed to understand how human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, how has been impacted our communities. We have been criminalizing, profiling, and putting in prison our communities instead of really protecting them and giving them the resources that we deserve. So that's the first thing that I would like, that it's part of my job. The other part is that I'm doing local, state, and national work on policy and legislation around human trafficking in different states, especially right now around the equality model, that I hope that we have a little time later to talk about it. And some of the contemporary issues or problems that I think that we are facing. First is the romanticization and prostitution, and the lack of understanding between the links, prostitution and human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking. Second is the normalization of sexual violence, especially on the marginalized communities. And especially I want to highlight that the normalization of sexual violence towards the LGBTQ plus community. And the third one is all the misinformation and myths around human trafficking. And when I'm talking about myths, I'm referring about the misunderstanding that adults cannot be trafficked, that males cannot be trafficked, and how trafficking is really happening. Because I think so that most of the people, the understanding is that the only way to be in traffic is through force. And we always forgetting or put aside the component of psychological coercion. So these three, the romanticization of prostitution, the normalization of sexual violence, and the misinformation around human trafficking are, I would say, the three main contemporary issues that I can see.
Thank you, Christian. And Chris?
Yeah, bonjour, hello. It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me in. And so I have done a lot of different organizing, grassroots organizing for 32 years now. And I've only done a little bit of direct service. That was with the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center when I was the LGBT Two-Spirit program coordinator. So, you know, I come out of this place where I'm piecemealing together a living in order to be able to do our writing and speaking and research. And that's been, you know, my background. I'm also a survivor. I'm a survivor of intergenerational family trafficking. And so that would be one of the things that I would identify as a contemporary challenge, is to get people to understand, and kind of like what Christian is talking about, that, you know, sex trafficking has a much broader scope than sort of the mythology that is put out there around it. Certainly the images of like women being stuffed in pickle jars, you know, and so forth, like those things are just really pretty devastating in order to do this work in a good way and adequate way, and one that's reflective and truthful of the realities of how people get into this and are used in it. in terms of the work that I'm doing now, it's focused around Native sex trafficking. I'm a Native woman, and so that's just my community. And the biggest thing with that is just the invisibility, the ongoing invisibility of Native people, the ongoing invisibility of Native women, and then that just, of course, trickles right down into the anti-sex trafficking work. I mean, we're seeing more understanding, so I really appreciate being invited here to talk about this, and for other Native people to be brought forward into this movement. But it's the invisibility, and the other thing I would say too is that it is the entrenched nature, particularly in the Native community, of what we now call sex trafficking and colonization. And the lack of understanding that this is not about, I mean, it might be about this for some, but at its core, this is not about like making sure that we have enough housing and we're going to take care of the issue of sex trafficking. This, we talk a lot about the intergenerational trauma in the Native community. One of the things we don't talk about is the intergenerational perpetration among, primarily white men in this country. And that's a thing, that's a real thing that keeps all of this in place. And until we find a way to go up against that, which means going up against our institutions, we're not going to make a lot of headway around this issue.
Thank you, Chris. And Lauren?
Thanks so much, Michelle, for having me. So World Without Exploitation is a national coalition designed to combat human trafficking and sexual exploitation. We were founded about 4 years ago, sort of recognizing that there was so much good work happening across the country, but for the vast majority of those organizations doing this work, they had two things in common. They were overworked and under-resourced. And so it was very tough to pull people together and really sort of leverage partnerships because nobody had the time to focus on sort of big ticket systemic change. And so we launched with just a few organizations. To date, we have about 190 organizations from around the country. We are pulling people together in critical moments to change laws, policies, and perspectives. And we're doing a lot of education. We also have a webinar series. It was weekly during sort of the height of everything that was going on. And in the fall, we shifted to once a month, and we've tackled some really tough topics. This last month, we did a webinar actually with Chris and Christian Eduardo and 8 other survivors, talking very honestly about the importance of listening to survivors, and that survivors need to be at the helm of this work, driving their agenda. And so, in terms of contemporary issues, I think this is one of the biggest issues that we're facing right now. I think there is a very loud cry, especially from the survivor community, saying that the equality model is really necessary, that we need to make sure that I think there's a big push out there to fully decriminalize the sex trade. And I think a lot of people are confused about what that means. And what that actually means is decriminalizing pimps, sex buyers, and brothel owners. And so survivors that we work with are saying this is not the way. What we really want to see is we want to see sex trade survivors and folks sold in the sex trade decriminalized, given exit strategies and services, and at the same time, those who exploit, they should be held accountable for the devastating harm that they cause.
Thank you, Lauren. And I want to give you and Christian both an opportunity to talk about the equality model, because it was even when I had spoken with you a few weeks ago, I didn't know about the amount of advocacy work that's going around in New York right now. So I was wondering if both of you guys could explain exactly what this policy is and why you think it will work for New York.
Christian, you want to start and then I'll add?
Yes, of course. So the equality model, it's also called in other countries as the Nordic Model because it has implemented on the northern part of Europe. So the equality model is the implementation of the same model, of course, with changes on legislation, because here in the United States, things are different. So the equality model has different prongs. The first prong is decriminalize the people who is being bought and sold, regardless of how you identify. You can be identified as a sex trade survivor, as a sex trafficking survivor. You can be identified as a prostitute, as a people who is being bought and sold. It doesn't matter. Regardless your identification, we understand that prostitution is a system that preys upon vulnerable communities, upon vulnerable and marginalized communities, and that who are profiting for them, and buyers, brothel owners, and of course, exploiters and sex traffickers. So the first prong is that decriminalizing the people who is being bought and sold on the sex trade or on the prostitution. The second prong is criminalizing all the people and keeping them accountable: buyers, brothel owners, sex traffickers, and exploiters. The third part of the equality model is the educational part, just what we are doing right now. It's like really connecting the dots between human trafficking, prostitution, sexual violence, and gender-based violence, and really how it is rooted on patriarchy, racism, xenophobia, transphobia, and homophobia. So it's creating policies and legislations, listening to survivors, and the last component is creating holistic services. And actually, this is happening already in New York City through the Empower Center. It's a center that is giving holistic services. What is the meaning of holistic services? Giving resources available and in different languages for legal, medical, mental health, immigration, and yes, and it's medical, legal, immigration, mental health, and they are available for everybody who is on the sex trade. We cannot force anyone who identify as a survivor to access these services. Lauren, am I missing something?
I don't think so. I think you pretty much nailed it. I think that just the sort of key components are decriminalizing those sold in the sex trade, making sure they get exit strategies and services, recognizing that the vast majority of those sold in the sex trade are not there by choice. They're there because of lack of options and other vulnerabilities, and making sure that we're holding accountable those who exploit for the devastating harm they cause. I think you nailed it, Christian Eduardo.
Thank you for explaining that. And a theme that I think has come up throughout this entire series, obviously, because we're centering the conversation around intersectionality, something that you just raised, as well as each one of the panelists has raised, is the lack of attention that has been paid to these marginalized voices, whether they be Native women or immigrants, particularly Black trans youth. So I was wondering if Christian, Chris, maybe if you want to start, but I think everyone would possibly have something to add on how we can make sure that all of these marginalized voices and experiences are actually reflected in all this advocacy effort. And if you want to go first, Chris or Christian.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And one of the things that we've done in the here in Minnesota in the Native community is that we did a study called the Garden of Truth, the prostitution and sex trafficking of Native women in Minnesota. And so that's been a strategy of ours and a passion of mine as a survivor, is how to bring other survivors, or however they identify, voices to the table so that they can be heard. And the reality is that a lot of, those folks aren't in a place where they're safe enough in order to physically come to the table. And so by doing this community-based research, we were able to interview 105 Native prostituted and sex trafficked women and create culturally appropriate questions along with the other questions that Melissa Farley uses in her research. And so MUSAC and Melissa Farley's organization, I was a member of MUSAC at the time, we're able to talk to the women and document their experiences and the things that they've gone through and how they view prostitution, which the vast majority of them said that they view it as, the same system of colonization. And so I think that that's one particularly effective way to bring forward people, so that those who we're not silent, we're silenced, right? So, you know, this system, this culture that we live in, the United States of America, it systematically has silenced and continues to silence those most marginalized and those most harmed by this system. So how do we stop that silencing and bring forward those voices? And I think the community-based research is one very effective way to do that.
I would say that it's very, very important, first of all, like to understand that even ourselves right now on the panel, we have privilege. That's the first part to make sure that we are listening and that we are creating policies, legislation, or advocacy effort towards marginalized communities. So the second part is understanding the intersectionality. I think so that there's this misunderstanding about being native, being the LGBTQ+. I think so that we separate these entities, and we need to understand that there is an intersection. I'm part of the LGBT community. I am an immigrant. I am a non-native English speaker. So to understand this, if you understand this intersection, that's the really way that we can create legislations and policy that are going to protect people like me. Because we need to understand that laws, policies, and legislation are made to protect those in need, to create resources and to create real paths for them. So listen to survival for me, and we need to understand that for a survivor, it's extremely hard to speak about our stories, because we speak about the realities about prostitution. We speak about the realities about how people is being groomed. We speak the realities about why people is engaged in prostitution. My community, my immigrant community, my LGBTQ+ community, we have been engaging in prostitution on the sex trade. We have been trafficked because of lack of resources. I think so that we lack to understand this. Even now, there are people who are engaging on the sex trade in prostitution because they don't have housing, they don't have food, they don't have legal resources, they have families, and they need their resources to continue surviving. In order to move forward, to create an equal world, and where in a world that there is no more exploitation, we need to acknowledge that. And we need also to acknowledge how we play part of the systems. And when I'm saying playing part of the system, I'm calling out, like, because law enforcement and all the laws has been failing us for years. They have been criminalizing my community. They have been profiling my community. We have been arrested. We have been put in jail. Why? Because we are the ones that we don't know how to protect. We cannot raise our voices. Nobody has been hearing us, and this has been happening. So I think so that this is so important, and that is why I'm always advocating for this. Yes, we cannot criminalize the people who are being bought and sold, because regardless why they are there, we need to acknowledge that the majority of people there, they don't have opportunities. They don't have choices. So I am always inviting people, like, to find the common ground. Don't create this fight against each other. We'll want to protect and empower our communities. And in order to do that, we need to recognize how the system has failed and listen to the voices of survivors.
Thank you so much for sharing that. If anyone else has anything to add, I'd like to possibly switch over to Selena and ask you, your work is predominantly with youth, and I don't know if you're juvenile survivors, and could you tell us a little bit more about the difference between assisting both adults and juvenile survivors, and if there's like a difference in reporting and the responsibility when you come across juvenile survivors?
Absolutely, Michelle. So working with juvenile survivors varies from working with adult survivors. So youth under the age of 18 do not have to demonstrate force or fraud or coercion to prove trafficking. Just that they were involved in a commercial sex act, that means that they are trafficked. Youth often don't understand that they've been exploited. So NYPD shared in a news article about a year ago that the majority of youth in the New York City child welfare system and other youth within New York City involved in commercial sex are under the control of what's called a Romeo Pimp. So this is a boyfriend or girlfriend or best friend, someone who pretends to be in a romantic or friendship relationship with them, but instead psychologically manipulates them into exploitation. And so youth also under the age of 18 are in the custody of a parent or a person who's legally responsible for them. And unless they're emancipated, they cannot plan for themselves without participation from the custodian. So this can become really challenging if the parent or person legally responsible has either trafficked the youth or has contributed to the situation through which the youth has become trafficked, mainly abuse or neglectful situations. So if the parent or person legally responsible has in any way contributed to the situation in which the youth has become trafficked, even if they're not the trafficker per se, what's needed to be done is to contact the New York State Central Register for Child Abuse and Maltreatment, it's known as the SCR. And you need to report this under what's called a sex trafficking allegation. Now, this is a brand new allegation, and the operators at the SCR understand what it means. They've been trained, because in years past, when you called the SCR and you explained that a youth was trafficked, but the parent or person legally responsible was not the trafficker, then it became rather challenging to get the report in. But now there is an understanding, and these cases are coded as high priority 14, which is child sex trafficking. Also, we report to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, as you would for an adult, but we also report to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children if the child is trafficked and missing. And additionally, if you are reporting a situation to the State Central Register, you can give us a heads up at the Office of Child Trafficking Prevention and Policy, because that child is going to land on our desk. And so if you want to make contact with us ahead of time, you can go ahead and get a hold of us at child.trafficking@acs.nyc.gov. And as I said before, we respond 24/7, 365 to a variety of mailboxes. So there's always somebody there.
Michelle, can I just add one quick thing? And it's not necessarily technical, but I think that the points that Selena's raising are so essential, because we see, I mean, as a former prosecutor, I saw firsthand that the vast majority of my cases that came in tended to be young people, many who were exploited in the sex trade before their 18th birthday. But I just want to flag something, because so often when we talk about sex trafficking, people want to talk about young people, and we absolutely should, but I think it's important to also acknowledge that for the vast majority of those young people, they don't become any less exploited after they have an 18th birthday. And so it is so critically important that when we're looking to pass legislation, when we're considering services, we also have to make sure that we're caring for people after their 18th birthday as well.
Can I add something to that? Because I absolutely agree with you. And the more barriers that a community has, like Christian is talking about as well, and I'll talk about the Native community, that the more layers of barriers that you have, the harder it is for you to get out of this system of prostitution and trafficking. And there's been studies done that show, of course, we know that the vast majority of people who are in prostitution as adults, you know, were brought in as children or exploited as children. And the one study that was done in Hawaii, primarily with Indigenous women, shows that 80% of those who were currently in prostitution had been brought into this industry through being trafficked. And one of the things that we see here in Minnesota in the Native community is that we have elders, we have grandmothers, and we have great-grandmothers who are being trafficked, but also having to engage in prostitution without necessarily a pimp. because they have nothing and nowhere else to turn because of the multi-layers of barriers that keep them from participating in all of these, the employment and finding housing and so forth. We have grandmothers and great-grandmothers who are being raped for hours after they've been picked up on the streets of Minneapolis, and nothing is done for them. They file rape kits and nothing is done. There's no follow-up. It's unbelievable and totally outrageous. So I just wanted to share that as an example.
So I'd just like to also add the importance of calling the SCR, and the criteria is when you have a reasonable suspicion. So we have a lot of youth who we don't definitively know are trafficked, but we know that they're at risk of trafficking only because we don't have a disclosure or any other distinct evidence. And that's really, really important because a lot of kids are very defensive, and rightfully so. They're not going to talk about the abuse and the trauma that they suffered, especially to somebody in a position of power from an authority agency. So it's a real challenge to figure out whether youth are at risk of trafficking or whether they're actually trafficked. So it is imperative to recognize that youth at risk of trafficking are just as important as youth who've been trafficked, because it's going to end up in that progression, as you said. At risk, we don't know, definitively trafficked as a juvenile, and continuation as you hit a mature legal age.
I want to follow up and ask both Anita and Selena, recently with COVID, we know that at least for domestic violence and child abuse, right, initially in the beginning, we saw this spike and then a sharp decline in all reporting. And we know that that does not mean that this abuse stopped, but that the barriers of reporting, whether it be the traditional ways that we have known child abuse reports to be through teachers in school, seeing bruises on young children, or access to actually being separated, right, from an abuser. What have you seen within trafficking survivors during COVID? And also, what are some ways that I guess you're trying to work to combat these challenges?
So with COVID, I mean, very similar to domestic violence. I know Safe Horizon was flooded with lots of media requests to talk about the prevalence and the increase in domestic violence because of the pandemic. And no one was really talking about human trafficking in the pandemic. And I will tell you, and I alluded to this earlier, our numbers of referrals either stayed constant at the beginning of the pandemic, and then they started to increase. So we saw as much, if not more, trafficking being reported during this time of the pandemic. And we expect this to continue well into next year and for years to come, not only in the sex trafficking field, but also for labor trafficking, because of all of the economic disparities and inequities that are going to be a massive economic fallout financially for so many different work sectors, employers, employees, et cetera. Across the field, no one's unscathed coming out of this pandemic financially. And so with respect to our clients, we had clients who, if they were being sex trafficked prior to the pandemic starting, they either lost their housing if they had left their trafficker, they lost their housing and had to go back to their traffickers because that was the only way they had access to housing for some survivors. And so then they were re-trafficked by individuals. And so we had clients who were actively being re-trafficked during the course of this pandemic because otherwise they would have been out on the streets. And remember, the pandemic here at least started in February and March. We were still in winter. No one wants to sleep on the streets, and you're caught between two impossible choices. And so, you know, these are choices no one would ever want to make. In terms of labor trafficking, we had a lot of clients who were reporting to us that they were either summarily dismissed from their jobs as primarily domestic workers, because now the family is home and have to be indoors in all quarantines. Either family members lost their jobs, so they don't have the disposable income to pay domestic workers. And so now the domestic workers who relied on being live-in home health aides or any other type of domestic workers, and they relied on that live-in status for their housing, their food, et cetera, they're without all of that now. And now they're incredibly vulnerable to re-trafficking. We had other clients who were previously labor trafficked in a multitude of different industries, including hospitality and restaurants, agriculture, construction, et cetera, who now they were forced to work even longer hours. I mean, we know with agriculture, we know with workers working in factories making PPE, both here and abroad, all of our essential care workers, our healthcare workers. The onus was put on them to keep this country functioning during the height of the pandemic. And most of the essential workers in this country are immigrant workers. They are migrant workers. They are people of color. They were already the most impacted and already the most vulnerable. And again, the disproportionate burden fell on them. And this is what our clients were reporting to us. And so you're in this very heightened situation of housing insecurity, food insecurity, loss of jobs. People are sick. People can't access medical care because either they don't have status or they don't have access to medical insurance, or they're terrified to go to a provider because they don't want to get sick, or they have to care for children, or they're living with immunocompromised individuals and they can't afford to go out in society. And so these were the things that our clients have been grappling with for months now. And remember that the clients started out in a place of vulnerability with all of these exacerbating factors, right? That led them to be, more susceptible to re-trafficking. And so you add on this pandemic and life becomes almost impossible for so many people.
Thank you. And Selena, do you have anything to add, or anyone else? Yeah.
So it's a little bit different in the child welfare system because it was business as usual during COVID. So although a lot of the not essential workers, meaning you don't have direct contact with clients, say doing investigations or working in residential group home facilities, so a lot of that staff did work remotely from home. All of the direct contact essential staff, all of those aspects of ACS kept on going. So nothing really changed. So even though youth had safety mandates, youth still went ahead and did what they were going to do. We didn't see much difference in the numbers between the first quarter and the second quarter and the third quarter of 2020. But you have to also understand that this is completely new to everyone, and a lot of the youth are not technologically savvy, and so they went about business as usual. On the other hand, we've heard, but anecdotally, that there has been an increase in the use of social media for trafficking because of the accessibility to it, not for the lack of going out on the street, but just because this is something new. And we've also heard that some of the folks who've been also using social media all along are a little perturbed at the competition now with so many more people utilizing it.
Thank you, Selena. And I think we should follow along this thread of technology, because I guess that's maybe one of the newest elements of the anti-trafficking movement that we really need to pay attention to. Most notably in 2018, when Backpage.com was shut down for enabling the trafficking of minors. And shortly after that, new sites began to emerge right after Sesta Fosta. The New York Times recently reported on the growing amount of childhood pornography that's being posted on websites like Pornhub. So my question is to Lauren specifically: how can people within the anti-trafficking movement address this rapidly changing tech world?
It's not just people in the anti-trafficking movement, I think. I think it's on all of us. I mean, I speak as a lawyer, but also as a parent. I think that just the amount of access that our young people have to really horrific, misogynistic content it's off the charts. I mean, the New York Times reported, I think probably a lot of people saw the Nick Kristof article, and then sort of what happened next, which was that Pornhub began to respond, because what came to light was the fact that there were, tons of rape videos on Pornhub, and there were many ways that Pornhub and other companies were basically monetizing child rape. And I think that just as humans, we have an obligation to respond. And so I think just, I know you want sort of to talk about from the attorney's perspective, but I think it's kind of on all of us to make sure that we are calling on Congress, members of Congress, to investigate companies that are producing content, that companies that are knowingly facilitating trafficking and are disseminating images of child rape. And so I would just encourage people to pick up the phone and call their member of Congress and urge that investigation, especially into Pornhub right now.
Yeah, and really follow the money. These are corporations that are making, they're the biggest pimps in the United States, and the money that they make off of pornography and other forms of trafficking. I'm a survivor of what we call child trafficking. I mean, I survivor a lot of different stuff, incest, and I was used extensively in pornography from the time that I was a toddler. And, the kinds of things that are now, like Lauren is talking about, that are widely available on the internet, were being done to me and to other children, many decades ago. I know people who are in their 70s and 80s who were used in pornography. And it's a horror show. I think that the other thing to understand about this is just the amount of extreme violence that is inflicted even on very, very young children, toddlers, elementary school children, through this pornography, and to raise awareness around that, and also to bring forward in terms of providing services and healing, torture. This is torture, and we really need to get up to speed on this because the industry is getting worse and worse and worse. And we need to follow that. As horrific as it is, we need to get up to speed on that.
Michelle, I would just add one other thing, which is that if there are prosecutors who are listening right now, I think that in any sort of intake with any survivors of sex trafficking, we should be asking about online content, because I think that prosecutors will find that where there is exploitation, there tends to be recorded exploitation that's being uploaded and shared. And I think that, that prosecutors really need to make sure that we're asking the right questions in a sensitive, thoughtful, trauma-informed way to really understand the comprehensive nature of the exploitation.
So if I can have just a word about perception. So the usage of the word pornography troubles me, and I'm not critiquing anyone who uses it. It's a terminology that's used every day, child pornography. But when I train, I try and have people look at it as the perspective of sexual abuse involving images and media. Mm-hmm. So if you think of it as sexual abuse involving images, it becomes so much more realistic as to what it is, because I just feel that the term pornography normalizes it. It minimizes it. So that's just how my comment and how I train staff.
I agree with you completely. I'm so glad you raised that point. I think it's a really important one.
That's an incredibly important point, as well as training overall. We have many, as you said, prosecutors who are on the call, and, within law enforcement, prosecutors, service providers, there are certain communities who have faced a tremendous amount of also stigmatization, specifically the LGBTQ plus community. So Christian, I was going to ask you if you could explain what you think this stigmatization looks like, how it manifests in the interactions between survivors and law enforcement. And I know that you are passionate about training and educating first responders and these service providers to address these unique challenges that marginalized and minority survivors face.
Yeah, so it's really, really important, especially for prosecutors and those who work in law enforcement, that recognize that you have a lot of privilege. You have a lot of privilege. And I think so that you fail, you have not been trained to recognize this, even when you are in front of a survivor, in front of a victim. In most of the cases, we are seen just as numbers, just as a notebook with notes, with numbers, with dates, just as a case. So this is super important to you to understand this. Like, we have been destroyed not only physically, emotionally, psychologically. And for all victims of human trafficking, there can be this imbalance of power. So when you don't acknowledge your privilege and you cannot see us as a human being, you are mirroring what traffickers were doing to us. So it's very important to keep this in mind. I am making a call for real. Like, we are not just cases, we are not just numbers, we are human beings. And that's why we have failed to protect victims and survivors. That's why we need to stop criminalize victims and survivors. On the other part, I think so that especially with the LGBTQ plus community, we have always been portrayed as the most sexually open. Like, like if we are immune to towards sexual violence, like if we cannot suffer from rape, like if it's normal to be exploited, like if it's normal, like all these things, like pornography, like sex trafficking, prostitution, like society has been making sure that the LGBTQ plus community is associated totally like that we are not more worthy than our bodies. And we need to understand that, because especially prosecutors, law enforcement, they have been perpetuating this. I think so that especially when we work with a gay man, with a lesbian, with a transgender person, the first thing that we came into our mind, instead of thinking, oh, this is a human being who needs resources and support, we always jump to, are you a woman or a male? What is your name? Like, we always want to know more about us, and that needs to stop. Like, training around gender expression, sexuality, it's a must for real, because if not, this is going to continue to creating barriers. So just for real, a reminder, we are human beings, and our experiences, we are more than our experiences and our stories.
Would it be okay for me to add something to this? Is there time? Yeah, and the other thing that is not really discussed is that the largest genre in heterosexual pornography is lesbian pornography. So what kind of impact does that have in, all sorts of ways, to the individuals, to the lesbian community, to how straight men view lesbians, to the women who are forced to participate in, creating this so-called lesbian pornography. The other thing that I want to say is that, when I was growing up, I was used in pornography. Pornography was made of me as a child, as a toddler, all the way until I escaped as an older teenager. And my father would show me lesbian pornography, and the lesbian in the pornography was sadistic and violent and abusive. And I was aware that I was a lesbian at a very young age. I cannot tell you the amount of tension and extreme layered trauma that caused for me to see that, because I was looking at images of something that I knew I was, and this woman was, sadistically harming another woman. And it was just like out of this world with psychological trauma that I still carry around to this day. I mean, this is ongoing and untalked about. We really need to talk about it more. So I really appreciate also, Christian, your voice in this.
I want to turn back to also the looking forward in this movement, taking all of these things that we've been discussing. And, I think part of the panel is looking at the next steps in this movement. And next year, there's going to be a new presidential administration that's seeking to make, criminal justice reform and gender-based violence a priority. So I was wondering if each of you can tell me one priority that you think this incoming administration should really focus on in regards to addressing human trafficking.
I can.
Oh.
You want to go ahead first, Selena?
Okay. Funding, and more funding, and yet more funding for a diversity of programs. You need therapeutic anti-trafficking programs for survivors, especially for boys and men and LGBTQ, especially young transgender women of color, which is one of the highest correlated populations for sex trafficking, especially here in New York City. Awareness programs for communities and preventive programs in schools. Now, this is really, really important because trafficking really needs to be imbued into middle and high school programs. But in New York City, it's up to the principal to decide whether or not that there's going to be a trafficking program. And I've heard from different schools that it requires documented permission from parents to allow their children to participate. And this is a big problem because trafficking education is not sex education. Trafficking is trauma, and awareness is needed to prevent the trauma. So if I haven't said funding yet, I say funding.
I will cheat and say, yes, I agree with Selena. So then I'm not going to say funding. I'll say something else, which means I get two. But given that we have a new administration coming in, I think there's so many different intersections when we're looking at the anti-trafficking movement with other types of victimization, other types of systemic oppression, poverty, racism, misogyny, transphobia, et cetera, right? And so when we're looking at that, we're looking at the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the 3 Ps, so protection, prevention, and prosecution. The United States' approach has historically been very, very entrenched in prosecution. But we saw from the most recent TIP report that the numbers of prosecutions have actually declined, especially with respect to labor trafficking, which have never been in parity with the numbers of federal prosecutions of sex trafficking. But what a number of us in our different coalitions at the national level are advocating for is that let us spend a lot more time, a lot more resources funding, as Selena is saying, and investing in protection and prevention. And so this goes to the trainings that Selena was talking about, but it also goes to let's increase the mandate and the power that's vested in the federal government. There's so much now that's allotted to Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security. And we want to widen this mandate. So now we also are increasing the authority of Department of Labor. We know that labor trafficking is incredibly pervasive. So let's increase the mandate of Department of Labor. Human trafficking is a public health issue. Let's increase the mandate of Health and Human Services. And so we want to have the same types of funding and support and resources, which we know are not enough, that are already given to Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security to be given in parity with Department of Labor and Health and Human Services. And so I think this would address a lot of the intersectional issues that we've been talking about. We know that Black and brown people, immigrants, the most vulnerable, marginalized populations don't have equal access to medical care that other folks have access to. And so that is something that would be immediately addressed, hopefully, by Health and Human Services. And none of these federal agencies are perfect. We know that. We know that there's turnover, that things change with every policy shift and every administration, but we need to start putting in as much investment and focus and emphasis on protection and prevention as we have done with prosecutions.
Christian?
I would say, yes, I would say that it's extremely important to review the over-criminalization of marginalized and vulnerable communities, because I think so that we have extremely failed over that, especially that remember that we're a country of immigrants, like, and really like start talking about this and this other pandemic, this other virus that we have that is sexual violence, and start romanticizing it. We really need to tackle this. Like as Selena was saying, like sex trafficking is happening. The demand is so high that the sex trafficking is happening. So we really need to start talking about this and how it's impacting our communities.
Yeah, I think that the number one thing for me would be the funding. It would be the, the equality model. I guess those are two things now. But the number one thing would be that the Native community needs funding in order to create culturally appropriate services by and for the Native community. We have to have our services that are specific to our cultural ways, and they, are often very different from the dominant society. And the women are not going to, typically go to services unless they have unless they're Native focused. And the ways that we address and the ways that we heal from these are very different from the dominant society. And we need to have those ways funded, whether they're quantifiable by the dominant society standards or not. Like our ways are our ways and they work for us. And we really need allies to advocate for funding for those services.
Really quickly, I mean, I would certainly echo everything that my colleagues have said, especially on the funding front. But the other piece of the equation for me is that to date, the online things online are basically just completely without regulation. And I would really encourage us to take a serious look at where we are online, the devastating harm that's being caused online by entities like Pornhub, and push for some sort of regulation. Many of these laws are outdated and really need a hard look and some serious amending.
Thank you all. And I do want to acknowledge some of the things that have come up in the chat, which also leads into one of my concluding questions that I had. But just looking forward, Christian and Chris and Lauren have told us a lot about the equality model, and there are a lot of different models and policies that are out there. So I don't know if any of you could speak to any other things that we should be looking out for in regards to models or policies.
Yes, it is really important that actually acknowledge that there was introduced a full decriminalization bill, but most of the people just refer it as the decriminalization bill. But what people are not saying is how this is going to impact our current laws working on sex trafficking, and they are really looking forward to decriminalize buyers, brothel owners, and literally like exploiters. So that is a main issue that especially prosecutors and students and everybody must be aware of that. And that is why one of the reasons that I'm advocating for the equality model, because we recognize that they are the ones who are driving the system, they are the ones in power with the system, and they are the ones who are profiting with the system.
So I'd like to take a minute to talk a little bit about the policy that ACS has, which of course, in our opinion, is the best policy, but it is a very holistic model. And we focus, it's called Identifying, Assessing, and Safety Planning for Sex and Labor Trafficking Victims. And it focuses on just that, identification, assessment, and always safety planning. So we need to focus on identification because you can't help a person that you don't know needs help. And you have to provide training so that identification ability is heightened, and to work with the survivor to support and empower them and involve them in developing their own individualized safety plan where they are at that time, because today's safety plan is not always tomorrow's safety plan. In fact, it rarely is. And to provide appropriate services based upon all of their needs, but really importantly, to have an open door or coverage all the time, 24/7, 365, because crisis doesn't happen at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. It happens on Sunday at 3 in the morning. And yes, I get phone calls at Sunday at 3 in the morning. And to always learn from your work to apply it towards prevention and ongoing model improvement. I just want to make one little comment about our last question when we were talking about the proliferation of all of the sexual abuse across the web, and we're fighting it by trying to empower community members and youth by developing different group work models. We have one called cyber safety and stress reliefs, and we use that to focus the youth and let them understand about the dangers out on the web. So maybe we can't stop it legislatively, but we're going to stop it kid by kid by empowering them.
So I'll just add our perspective here, and it's a little bit different from what's already been expressed. So we don't take a position on decriminalization, but we also don't endorse the equality model either. We know that this is a very nuanced issue, and I personally have worked with survivors, including adult sex traffic survivors, adult labor traffic survivors, and adult individuals who engage in sex work of their own free volition. And so I can take their word for it, because I'm not in their bodies to say this is what they have or have not done, or this is what their state of mind is. And so based on what individuals have told me, that's the truth that I'm sort of holding here. And it's a very complicated situation. And so because of that, because we know that because we've spoken with individuals who say that they're engaging in this work voluntarily, but we also know there's a spectrum of choice, circumstance, and coercion. And once you get to the coercion side of the spectrum, either a force, fraud, or coercion, that's trafficking. Everyone agrees that that is trafficking. We all know that under law, New York state and federal law, if you're under the age of 18, by law, it's trafficking, whether there's force, fraud, or coercion. So everyone agrees on that as well. I think everybody agrees that those who are engaging in commercial sexual activity, as in terms of providing that, they should not be criminalized, that they should have increased access to services, medical care, public benefits, housing, food, educational opportunities, employment, et cetera. Everybody agrees on that too, which is really nice about this field. I think that there's some, what's the word? There's some differences in opinion on the other side of it, but like I said, Safe Horizon does not take a position on decriminalization. We are primarily federally funded, and so that's why we don't take a position on decriminalization. But you know, we have worked with survivors who say that they engage in this work voluntarily, and they have expressed that there is no force or fraud or coercion in their behavior in inducing them or motivating them to enter into this field. And so with that, it becomes very complicated for us knowing that there's such a range of client experiences and realities to endorse or wholeheartedly support one model over another, because no matter what model you support, there are going to be individuals and survivors who don't agree with that model. And so it's not a one size fits all. It's completely impossible to do that. And we know that the anti-trafficking field, because of all of these intersections that we've been talking about, complex trauma, childhood histories of trauma, talking about intersections with race and age and ethnicity and immigration status and disabilities and sexual orientation and gender, that this field is very complicated. That is, I don't think I can ever overstate that. I can overstate that. And so just because of that one particular piece of it, there can't be a one size that fits all. And so that's where we stand. And we acknowledge that it's standing in sort of a middle ground, like no man's place, but we can, you know, we can't take a black and white line on this because the realities of humanity are so complex.
Yeah, and you know, I hear what you're saying. And there, I mean, that's true of any issue, right? If we look at domestic violence, so you're going to find plenty of women who are currently being abused in domestic violence who are going to say that it's okay and that it's not an issue and it's not a problem and they're fine. Same with rape survivors and so forth. So, you know, I don't see this as much about invalidating from all the research that has been conducted is a minority position from survivors on this issue, and yeah, no, you know, no one stance fits everyone. But the way that the federal government defines sex trafficking, and the way that we talk about it in the Native community, including in Canada, the First Nations communities in Canada, and again, now I'm not saying every Native person thinks exactly the same way, but you know, our organizations and our advocates and our survivors, you know, talk about, you know, that there are, it's much broader, that this idea of force or coercion is much broader and more nuanced than simply force, fraud, or coercion. There's, you know, centuries of colonization that have created systemic inequalities among people. And there's, you know, the CPS and removing of children to CPS in the boarding schools. And you have all of these other issues, including poverty and homelessness, that create this, you know, milieu of people who, if they're not being outright trafficked, you know, they don't have the opportunity to go and make a nice income and feed their children and buy clothes for their children. And so they're in this situation where, according to the federal definition, they're making a choice and they're fine and they're not, you know, they're not victimized in this. But, you know, that just seems just very unreal in terms of how people actually live their lives. And, you know, there's a Native, you know, Canadian Women's Association, and here in Minnesota and elsewhere, you know, we don't accept that idea that there are a few people saying that, and that trumps the vast majority and the systemic organized nature of the abuse of prostitution and trafficking. So that would be my take on this.
Yeah, I would just add one quick thing, and that is that if you look at the Palermo Protocol, you see the words force, fraud, or coercion, but you also see the words position of power and position of vulnerability, and that's really at the heart of what we see and what we hear from the survivors that we work with. That when we're talking about issues of prostitution, we're really talking about all the inequalities that we talk about, whether it's racial inequality, gender inequality, and income inequality. And prostitution is sort of the epicenter of all of that. And the one thing that sort of was left out of this conversation that we have to make sure that we're talking about, of course, we understand the vulnerabilities of those who are exploited, but we also have to be talking about the privilege of those who are purchasing and the role of demand in all of this, and really recognizing that the demand for commercial sex is really what's driving all of the exploitation out there.
Yeah, those men who are buying women out on the streets, they could just give them that money with no strings, right? They could just say, here you go. We have women who are being forced by wealthy white men from the suburbs of the Twin Cities, Native women, to enact colonial racist tropes like John and Pocahontas in order to feed their children. And they, under the federal definition, would not be identified as being a victim. And they are just, that is absolute victimization of racism and colonialism and sexism and poverty and homelessness. 98% of the women that we interviewed in Garden of Truth were homeless previously or currently. So this is a broad base of inequalities that have existed in this on this land, Turtle Island, since the arrival of the Europeans.
Thank you all. I mean, I really appreciate us being able to have this open dialogue about everything and really prioritizing looking at it through these multiple lenses. I think that that's critical. And I really appreciate you guys for having this conversation. I do want to be mindful, of course, of the time, because I know you guys are extremely busy and have things to get to. But again, I really appreciate you having this conversation and being so open and vulnerable. And I think to close out the panel, my final question before just a brief closing remark would be, can you all just name one thing that you're hopeful for going forward in the movement? If you keep it brief, but just, one thing.
I would like to start that to keep moving forward on the system is that really taking a stand. If we really want to protect our communities, we really need to take a stand, recognizing that prostitution is a system of oppression. And if not, I will toss the question that why most of the people engaged on the sex trade are from marginalized communities and suffering from poverty. And while even engaging on the system, we continue being on poverty. So that is a clear question that is a system of oppression. And the other thing is that we need to recognize that when we want to normalize prostitution and when we are saying that it's really okay, like to give access to our bodies, especially for the LGBTQ+ community, is we are saying that we don't care about my community, that we don't care about immigrants, that we don't care about those who are being impacted. Because while we can be lawyers, while we can be social workers, like teachers, like my community is being raped, my community don't have other opportunities. So why should we support a system that is doing that to our community? Instead of really empower a community, it's just profiting from them. Like we weren't born to survive. Survive is not enough, and we need to create real paths.
I mean, I'll just be really quick. The thing that makes me most hopeful is people like Christian Eduardo and Chris Stark just out there speaking truth every single day. And so they inspire hope in me and make me believe that the world will ultimately be a better place for my kids and their kids.
So one of the things that I'm very hopeful for is that sex trafficking has received a lot of recent media attention. Rarely there is a day without some sort of news coverage. You had Epstein, you had R. Kelly, now you've got Peter Nygaard using his fashion business to conceal sex trafficking. As more and more people develop an awareness of what's going on and an understanding about how victims can be exploited, they're going to develop empathy for the survivors. And developing awareness and empathy is the first and most hopeful step to combating trafficking, because where there's empathy, action will follow.
I think to piggyback on what Selena said, within our coalitions, we're also really actively working to increase community awareness of labor trafficking. And so I'm hopeful that as we continue to increase labor trafficking, which hardly anyone talks about, we want to put more funding and more resources to that. We want to really support and enhance and increase worker rights. And so I'm hoping under this new administration, we can turn a new leaf and we can really focus on worker rights, because this is a country of immigrants, as Christian Eduardo said, and this country would not function otherwise. And so really let's focus on worker rights, and I'm hopeful for the opportunities.
Yeah. I'm very happy. I'm very inspired. I'm very moved by the Deboe, and that means truth in Anishinaabe-Moen. And that's one of our core values, is to speak the truth, and that the truth matters, and that more and more of us are standing up, like Selena and Christian said, more and more of us are standing up and talking about the core truths of this issue, and we're being included, and that's really wonderful. So thank you for bringing us forward, and thank you for furthering the work around this issue, in particular as it is about the Indigenous community, which has been on this land before, many tens of thousands of years. And so, we appreciate that opportunity to be heard. So, miigwech.
Thank you so much to each of our panelists for sharing your time and expertise with all of us today. I sincerely appreciate the work that you all have done and continue to do. For our attendees, I dropped a few helpful links in the chat with some different resources that might be of interest. And later today, everything will be posted on our website in the initial link that I had sent. This is important work, and the past 4 panels have given me personally a lot of hope as we think about the modern challenges that we all face within the anti-trafficking movement. I think central to each discussion we have had is the inclusion, the protection, but mainly the healing of survivors. This is difficult and painful work for everyone involved, and prioritizing self-care and community care is really essential. And again, I want to thank the various departments at John Jay College for supporting the series, and my colleagues at the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution for making this series possible. I have a quote that Amber had sent me. She was unable to make it today, but she says it's on behalf of all survivors and anti-human trafficking activists, and it's by a survivor named Christy Ann Martin. And she wrote, "This is the chapter of my story where I trade a lifetime of fear for a lifetime of freedom. By learning how to fight, it's the part where I transform from victim to hero on every page that I write for the rest of my life." So thank you all, and I wish you a happy and healthy holiday season and a happy new year. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.